Last month, I co-hosted a Zoom call on spiritual and psychological resilience with Dr. Chris Stravich, a Catholic psychologist from Houston, when it comes to psychological resilience and tips for psychological resilience in a challenging time. So check that out on our website. We're going to look today at the issue of racial justice. And next week, in a couple of weeks as well, we'll be joined by, it has a new position at St. Thomas, Distinguished University Chair, Professor, and Founding Director of the Racial Justice Initiative, and really one of the most talented colleagues that I have at St. Thomas. Really, don't miss that. That'll be the 11th of November, again from 7 to 8:15. Tonight we focus on the topic of racial justice and the experience of circumstances in Minnesota and beyond. So a little bit of context before we begin. We have rising COVID, and we seem to hit a new record every day. We continue to see hospitalizations and deaths of our fellow Americans throughout the country. And we also see attendant social and financial harm that presents itself on multiple levels. Today, the stock market plunged 900 points. We are in a very challenging political reality of extreme political polarization that is at a fever pitch. We're less than 1 week away from really a historic election. And here in Minnesota, we experience all of this in a particularly intense and at times fraught way. This was the place of the killing of George Floyd on Memorial Day in May, and was the flashpoint for the tumultuous events that many Americans have had, including protests and in some cases rioting as well, that has been throughout the country in the summer and the fall. I believe it's also an opportunity here in Minnesota for real transformative change, change that builds a more just and inclusive Minnesota and society. What does our Catholic faith say about racial? It's an offense against God and the dignity of the human person. All God's children are equal in value and dignity. The bishops in the document Open Wide Your Hearts also call out racial injustice and racism as a scourge, including the bishops point to systemic racial injustice in our society. And what does that mean? It means it's system-wide. It really backs that up in a powerful way. Catholic social teaching talks about solidarity. We've talked about the dignity of the human person, the common good, social conditions that promote integral human development, the preferential option for the vulnerable. Well, those who experience persistent racial injustice are in fact vulnerable in our society. Pope Francis has called us to, as Catholics, to be those who embrace a culture of accompaniment and a culture of inclusion. Black Catholics have noted, including on both ends of the Catholic ecclesial spectrum, that there is too much apathy among white Catholics to racial injustice in our society. Members of our Lourdes family, and I'll introduce them in a minute. I'm very thankful. I reached out to these 4 individuals to invite them on our panel. They all said yes quickly, and I invited them because they're bright, they're thoughtful, they're compassionate, and they're prudent people of justice. One of the 4 sources of Catholic social teaching, and in fact a source of truth, is experience. Experience discloses reality. It discloses truth. We know through our experience. And so at the heart of restorative justice, which we've of our neighbors with whom we share a common humanity. And when we listen and open ourselves to others, we transformative. Now this happened to me a quarter century ago in law school at William Mitchell, when a number of my friends, our group were African American black law students. And I was a naive, white, middle-class Catholic kid from a part of Wisconsin that was not diverse. And it really opened my eyes, that experience a quarter century ago. And it was transformative, and that journey for me is ongoing. And so now I want to introduce our panelists, and then we'll get into the questions tonight. There is a telephone number where you can text questions to. It will be out via this live stream, but you're welcome to text that number, and we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers. And so, first of all, we have Mari Pillai, and members here for the past 12 years, since 2009. Mari grew up in Raj, have two adult children, and I believe some grandchildren as well. Mari worked at Siemens and also Procter & Gamble, and then for the last number of years as a senior executive at General Mills. She retired last November. And Mari is involved here at Our Lady of Lourdes in a number of areas, and we're very delighted that she's here. We have to her left Marshall Collier. Marshall is a native Minnesotan, grew up in the Cambridge area, was 23 years on the Minneapolis Police Department as an officer, and he retired this summer. We hired, and very happily so, hired Marshall as our new Director of Secure Environment here at Our Lady of Lourdes. Marshall is just a beloved of our Cara. And Sergio grew up in Arizona, and he and his wife, Keelan, right? Sergio Keelan, are members of our parish here. Sergio is a member of our Justice and Charity Committee. Incidentally, I'm using a wonderful new document that he just created and allowing my law students to learn from it next week. Sergio was invited into the economy of inclusion. Pope Francis's economy is what it's entitled, and he can correct me because I think I got the name wrong, but it is bringing people from across the Catholic world in November, and he was invited to be a member of this conference. Sergio is pursuing his PhD in economics at the University of Minnesota, and we're very delighted that he's here. And we're going to hear from Sergio in one of these sessions after his experience in November. And finally, and not least, we have Ryan Hammer here at Our Lady of Lourdes, along with Melissa, his wife, and their two children. Ryan grew up in South Carolina, attended Wake Forest and then Tulane Law School. He just, for the past couple of years, was working at the University of Minnesota in a particular capacity, and we're very happy to announce, this is fresh off the wires, that Ryan was just hired by the Minnesota Catholic Conference. It's official. He will be a lobbyist for the Minnesota Catholic Conference, and really delighted by that news. So I thank all of our panelists. We're very happy that you're here. The parish community hears far too often from me, so I'm going to stop talking, but I do have to ask the first question. Panelists, 3 to 5 minutes to answer the series of 3 questions, and we really do hope to leave some time at the end for your questions as well. So to the first question, your experience in Minnesota. A number of you have been in Minnesota for a number of years, but you can also broaden it to your experience in the United States. We have folks of various backgrounds and ethnicities. Your experience of Minnesota society, any experiences you might have had that you might describe as unjust or troubling or surprisingly positive, whatever it is, we just want to hear about your experience and any insights that you have, and then we'll move to the second question in a few minutes. So why don't I begin here? Ryan, why don't we begin with you? And if you could just, although maybe you were thinking we're going to begin here, we're going to begin because I think what I thought we were going to do. And Mari, why don't you begin and just give some thoughts.
So my comments will be broader, less so on Minnesota than on my experience just living in different parts of the world. Frog in my throat. All right, so first of all, as Father Dan mentioned, I've worked for 30 plus years at 3 great companies and as a professional career, and I honestly cannot point to any direct negative issues in the workplace. And this just speaks, I think, to one of the time. In the volunteer world, however, I've experienced, again, these are minor issues, I'd call them micro issues, not appointment to committee positions versus just ability and proven track record. So this does happen, not very, just in normal life. I have had white people cut me off or cut off in front of me in queues, whether it's the airport or department stores, etc. It's rare, but it has happened. And strangely, I feel, so at church, where I typically attend alone since my husband isn't Catholic, on occasion, when we offer the sign of peace, occasionally I feel that there is sometimes a hesitation to, interacting with me as an individual in that case. Again, not a major issue, but just something that kind of just you pick up on. Now, addressing the issue of Cleveland and Philadelphia. And it strikes me that attitudes and stereotypes really drive how people treat you, sometimes in a good way and sometimes in a not so good way. So, for example, Catholics in India are generally looked down upon because we have a different God, we behave differently, we act differently, we're non-vegetarians, whereas most of the country is vegetarian. And generally, the habits and practices that we follow are ones that are not in the mainstream. We're less than 2% of the population. So that was kind of interesting. Moving on to, we lived in Prague in Europe for a couple of years. We would get stopped because we looked different and were driving a German car. Now in Alabama, we had no issues, and this is the positive stereotypes because typically most Indians who were over there were either doctors or engineers. So we got the benefit of the doubt in that situation. And I think by and large in most US cities, that tends to be the stereotype, the positive stereotype of Indians. So those have been my experiences in the US. And
distinction between corporate America really focusing on, meritocracy and performance, and your positive experience with some of those other experiences that you've had. Any insight there?
No, I think being, in the professional workplace, that's kind of, especially the large companies, it's in a smaller company. Of course, in a larger company, you have all of these, rules and regulation. Not rules, and they're much more socially conscious, etc. And in order to have a workplace that's diverse and representable, to address different ethnicities, different races, etc. in the corporation. So,
as a child, I went to grade school in Bloomington and high school in Cambridge. So short amount of time in Cambridge, but largely white communities for school. And the experiences were hard sometimes, always feeling excluded or trying to fit in were those type of issues. Sometimes the positives were everyone thought I was an athlete or athletic, that I played the various sports, which I didn't, but I was very active in my growing up years in schools. My mother and father wanted me to experience, I and my siblings, experience a lot of different things in different cultures, which we did. We partook in a lot of things, hunting, fishing. The racial issues that I experienced were even in churches and church schools and secular schools as well, but mainly racial slurs and in an attempt to upset me and get a rise out of me. And they were just things that I learned to live with.
Marshall, if I could, vocation as a priest, there are some folks who have done some bad things. They ordered to God and neighbor, and that's about as nice as I can put it. But many people would point to both the priesthood and police officers and say, boy, there's a lot of really, really good people doing good things. And could you just speak to your experience as a police officer for 23 years in terms of, and I don't want to ask a leading question, but did you see a balance of good people trying to do good things, or did you see, pretty challenging kind of realities in terms of your former profession?
I saw a lot of great people trying to do great things. Very tough job, and sometimes the outcomes aren't great for everyone. But we, as police department and police officers, and just even two-man teams, were trying to keep the community safe, and with limited options many times. Sometimes we were battling human nature, human reaction, natural human reactions, to enforce the law or do it in a lawful manner, which aren't always the same. And so, it was much about selflessness versus selfishness. Our reactions have to be selfless and think of the community and the law. So that's how I tried to police the community myself.
Thank you. Sergio?
Okay, so I'm Sergio. I guess my experience is definitely unique. I come from this experience as a Hispanic, but not only a Hispanic, but a Mexican American, and not only a Mexican American, but a second generation immigrant. My dad was an immigrant from Mexico. My mom was Mexican American, but she grew up in a small town near the border. And as much as and I won't get into the politics or anything about it, but a lot of the experience that I've had, I can't separate it from immigration. And I guess I'll clarify that a little bit. I guess ever since I was young, I always kind of acknowledged that there was there was something about me that was different than everybody else, and I knew it was because of, I had tan skin, dark hair, Spanish name, stuff like that. And I learned growing up that there was two kinds of more or less immigrants, especially Hispanic immigrants. There was the legal and there was the illegal. There was the documented and the undocumented. And a lot of people think that it's fine that they could just partition people this way, and we're good classifying one group of people because they followed the laws and the other group of people because they didn't follow the laws. But even though I was an American citizen and my dad was a legal Mexican immigrant, this whole dichotomy and this grouping of people into categories still affected me as a kid. And I'll just give you examples. I mean, it doesn't take a lot for, once people start stereotyping a whole group of people, especially the undocumented, well, what do they start classifying them as? They say they speak a lot of Spanish. They tend to come from a lower socioeconomic class. They, and then the negative stereotypes come too, right? They're uneducated. They're not as smart, they're lazy, they abuse the welfare system, all these things. And these things were pretty much really cognizant to me when I was growing up. And so it was almost as if, there was pressure to kind of show that I was in the right group and not in the wrong group. And when those characterizations of the wrong group are associated with a people and the way of life of a people, well then what does that say to a kid, right? It says to a kid, it's bad to speak Spanish. It says to a kid, it's bad to be working class. My dad was working class. My dad's a construction worker. He didn't even have, I mean, like most people in Mexico, he didn't go to college. He didn't even have a high school diploma. But my dad worked hard. My dad is the hardest working man I've ever met. My mom worked hard. But, you know, that's what I learned. You know, I learned that in some sense that being Mexican was bad. And so I kind of took that up growing up as trying to disassociate something that was rich, that gave me my values, that gave me my work ethic, and I tried to disassociate myself from that, and it was wrong, you know, and I am embarrassed about it, but now, you know, I'm proud. I'm proud to be what I am, and I'm proud of my parents, and I'm proud of my culture, and if anything, like, that is the reason why I'm Catholic, you know? And when days are hard, like, that's what gave me my faith, you know, that experience of a people. And, I mean, I guess just to finish it up, just to talk about Minnesota, I mean, like I said, I spent a lot of time trying to pretty much show that I was just as American as everybody else. I even served in the Marine Corps for 5 years, but no matter what, it didn't really seem to matter, you know. And as much as things were bad in Arizona, like, I mean, the stories of deportations, right? Friends whose parents got deported and stuff like that. At the very least, the assumption wasn't most of the time that I was a foreigner, right? Or that I didn't necessarily belong. And Minnesota is probably one of the first places where that question comes up more often than not. Like, I go to events sometimes and people say, "Where are you from?" The very first person I met in Minnesota spoke to me in Dari, which I actually know because I was a linguist in the Marines. But he just assumed I wasn't from here, you know? And even speaking on a mission trip, people didn't see me as part of the parish. They saw me as, oh, he must have been one of the kids from Tijuana that came up, you know? And so this is kind of something that I've always had to deal with it, and I've pretty much learned to do it. But I will say a positive thing is that for the most part, even though people in Minnesota, and they've done these things and they've assumed that I was like from Latin America, they'll apologize at the end of the day once they kind of realize it, you know? And at the end of the day, I think that's kind of, I understand that people are gonna mess up, but I just want people to be a little bit more conscious of when they classify groups of people under stereotypes. So that's what I got.
Each of my three colleagues have told my story when you're talking about stereotypes. And, you know, my parents had advanced degrees in professional jobs. I went first through 8th grade at a Catholic school, wherein most of those 8 years I was the only African American in the class. So I've grown up with a to kind of get by, because I kind of know how to act. But, you know, approaching 40 years old, man, you know, just in Minnesota, you know, I own a home. I've beaten all the statistics. Some instances with police officers that, you know, were just downright humiliating. But at the same time, there were 3 where that I can think of where I was treated with dignity. You know, I guess my point is, I guess my experience, just trying to let others feel comfortable as opposed to walking in my own dignity. So that's all I have for now.
Let's, Ryan, we will stay with you. You know, beating all of the, the disparities in terms of your, 10 years here, and but the reality is Minnesota does have some of the most significant racial disparities in the country across a whole host of categories. Education, income, the gap, it's a 50-point gap in terms of home ownership in Minneapolis. The the most acute in the nation in terms of a metropolitan area. Stops by the police as well. Our late Tom Johnson, who went to the Lord in June, did a stop study here in Minnesota that was very significant and telling. What I want to explore when I hear of that is culture. So what is it within and I'm not saying Minnesota bad, but what is it in the culture? You've come from another part of the country and have been here for 10 years. How do we delve into the roots and get at the things that can be transformed, and any insights that you might have in terms of where some of that comes from?
Yeah, thank you for that prompt. I was a history major, so you got to think about the predominant culture in Minnesota. There's just not a lot of black people and people of color up here. So I think there's just not a lot of that experience. White people living shoulder to shoulder or seeing each other, on Main Street. Here, that's just not the case. So that's kind of what I was getting to. Here, you can get by here. And I just think it's the lack of familiarity with the cultures, which tends to, after 10 years, then the stereotypes kick in. And so rather than be an athlete, kind of like Marshall alluded to in his history, it's the insular culture and then that folds over into the stereotypes, political, but there is a nonprofit industrial complex in Minnesota that I've discovered over these years that are kind of, I guess it's coming from a good place, but they see us as we're the people that need to be helped, again, rather than seeing us within our own dignity and what we're bringing to the table when we come here from other parts of the country or other countries. And so it's the Minnesota Nice and this outsourcing of charity and kindness rather than engaging with the actual human being. I think that in my mind. That's really
helpful. Just 2 quick points. What people from outside of Minnesota find, whoever they are, is that insular culture sometimes can inhibit, inviting somebody to Christmas, or to the cabin. That is a part of the culture that people have experienced. It's also something I've pointed to with regard to chancery cultures. So when you have an insular clerical culture, as we sometimes see in the church, you don't bring in as many voices in a way that's inclusive, and that ends up, in terms of Minnesota culture, your experience of it, that would give us a kind of a clue as to why some of the most acute disparities occur here when it comes to race across a lot of categories.
Yeah, I think both you, Father, and Ryan both said good things, and I guess what I'm thinking of when I hear you two talk is, and I noticed this as soon as I moved here, is that people would say, and I'd hear other people who just moved here say, they'd be like, Minnesota's very segregated. And, very segregated. And it's very self-segregated. I mean, sure, there is a history of actual segregation happening, but it's just kind of embodied in the way that, people make their choices. And I think what that segregation tends to do is it usually goes along with a discomfort with anything that's different, right? But then I think what's really important is when you're segregated, when you don't get exposed to different people or their problems, then you're just not familiar with them. It more or less just kind of promotes an attitude of pursuing your own self-interest, even though you might not necessarily be being selfish, right? It's just the fact that you're constantly associating yourself with other people just like you. They have the same problems as you, and so you think that the only problems that are relevant are the problems that affect you. It doesn't surprise me that, and I remember being really disheartened about this, after the protests started happening, how quickly, the situation got polarized, where people of color were talking about, injustice and wanting more justice and wanting more opportunities for people of color. And then, a lot of my white friends would talk about the riots, and they would talk about the violence and the safety. And it was like, you're not really listening to what other people are saying. Hispanics, across the board, and even in Minnesota, one of the biggest disparities that Hispanics face is education. But I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize the problems that Hispanics actually face when it comes to education. And a lot of it's the language issues, a lot of it's, the fact that their parents are usually both working and working a lot. They don't have the kind of support that everybody else does. But when you don't know that, when you don't know the people, then you don't know how to help them, And so I think it's important to kind of break your bubble and, just encounter other people.
So thank you. Very, very helpful. Marshall, one of the things that has struck those who have gotten to know you, who have become friends with you, is how naturally you encounter people. You have like this preternatural, this uncommon sense for just engaging with people. And that seems to be such an important, it's at the heart of the Catholic faith as well, this idea of encounter. One of the things you've said, so either speak to the main question on hand in terms of anything you can point to that kind of presents challenges culturally that might manifest racial disparities, but also one of the things that you've said powerfully that I think could be helpful for our audience who are engaging is the lack of hope in some communities, and the lack of hope that results in despair that can manifest itself in behavior that might be criminal or just really problematic, and that can be passed down through generations. We call it, in the racial justice area, racialized harm, generational harm, in terms of experiencing that. But any of the questions that are on the table, or anything you want to talk about in terms of your experience?
I think that hopefulness and hopelessness is one of the things that segregates us also as a society, a community. There are people that are hopeless, so without hope, they don't have the energy to get up and go and find and create a new life for themselves. They become stuck in a track, and they just follow that track, that path, and without breaking out. And some of that hopelessness comes from, I think, as Sergio was saying too, about we're so segregated that we don't see outside ourselves and our problems. We do see people as those who have hope and those who don't. We see ourselves as hopeless. And so we don't break out and socialize and associate with people with hope. So, and I think that goes on both sides of that coin too. People with hope don't segregate with the hopeless, because I've got my own problems and I'm going to associate with the people that have the same similar issues and problems. And therefore we don't come together and break out, help one another break out of our cycles of poverty or hopelessness or misunderstanding.
Do you think that some of the underlying motivation, is it sometimes fear? Is it apathy? Is it just kind of, Pope Francis would just say, indifference, in terms of why we don't break out of our own groups and encounter others and learn? And what do you think?
The above.
Okay.
We don't ask. And some people are afraid of the reaction they'll get by asking. Asking the question why. But I think fundamentally hope is the underlying issue for all of Americans. Right now we're having a very controversial presidential race, and in the midst of a pandemic, and there are many people out in society that are feeling a lack of hope and fear. We have an epidemic of heroin use and fentanyl use in our communities. We have epidemic of mental health issues. And then we have the marginalized who are dealing with all those aspects of life in this rich nation that we live in. We have people sleeping under bridges and in parks, in tents. In America, in Minnesota, it's supposed to have such a great economy. That's hopelessness, I think. And some of them are hoping for better or different, and they don't know how to find different. So, if we want change, it begins with hope, and we have to build hope in others. And that means each one of us reaching a hopeless person and giving them hope, helping them find hope and drive to live and thrive.
It's powerfully said. And one of the things, just for our audience here, in terms of being COVID compliant, we had to set this thing up in a way where, they're socially distant, I'm in the shot as well. So when they look back at me, I know that's slightly awkward, but it's part of trying to play our part in public health here. So thank you for that. Mari, same question. Any thoughts?
So I know that there are a number of disparities. I know that at least at work and so on, we've talked about education, the educational gap being a really wide one. And from where I sit, and again, coming from India, where education is really the only way to disparity in poor countries typically is a lot worse than in richer countries. And, it's the teacher, the student, and the parents or the family. Any one of them being weak means the whole student. And then, as we know, poor education leads to poor jobs, and this becomes a vicious downwards. Society tends to be in terms of socioeconomic, groupings. You're tending to have that hope to see how you can get out of it. The other two comments I'll make here is, and often you find that these are sparse and few and far between. What can be done about this? But that is a part of what happens, and from a government standpoint, policies like affirmative action, et cetera, it's role models and what the government does, but there's also the importance of personal responsibility and actually can have lasting change. It's easy to implement broad-scale blanket policy. The success rate, I think, is likely lower than if you focus on the individual and help each person. It seemed like as I was preparing for this evening, and the reason I'm looking at my phone is not because I'm texting anyone, but because this is where my notes are talking about how hope is the most important thing at a time like this. And he talks about 4 items. 2 of them are that you have the ability to hold on to positive thoughts in order to pull yourself up. And the last one was, but this really struck to that, it's that spirituality or a belief in something larger than yourself. And then it goes on to, to help pull ourselves up. So.
Great. Thank you, Mari. And really given by the person of Jesus Christ, Pope Benedict wrote an entire encyclical. If you've never read anything that Pope Benedict's extraordinary. But then we know that there's a human dimension of hope. I think it's so critical. What both you and Marshall pointed to, which I thought was really striking, is the one-on-one dimension of helping build hope. That encounter again, I think is really fundamental. Mari, we're going to stay with you here for my final question. I do want to remind people that there is a telephone number where you can text questions to 763-645-4146. 763-645-4146. Please text your questions and we'll get those to our panelists. So the final question I have, and if we don't get questions in, I'll ask maybe a follow-up as I have been, or 2 as we close out the evening. But the final question is, how can people of faith, so all 4 of you are are people of Christian faith, and particularly Catholics, help build a more just and inclusive Minnesota? And what does the light and truth of our Catholic faith offer in this regard?
I think you mentioned it earlier, Father, on Catholic social teaching. I think, but fundamentally, we all need to respect all people and all types of work. And with that, we need to work really hard to avoid stereotypes and negative attitudes. So that's just at the very foundation, I think, of what we need to do in general. And then on a more secular note, I think we have a civic duty and a social responsibility to be aware of what's going on. We need to be informed. We need to vote, exercise our democratic rights. We need to support inclusive causes. It's happened. It is important for us, I think, to support that Black lives matter, all lives matter, but at the same time, violence and anarchy. And often what we saw, especially in the political realm, is that did not necessarily happen, and that was not a good thing, and definitely not a good thing for us to be role modeling for our children. And then I think, we talked about doing things, one volunteering at inner city schools. I know Sergio does that. So whether it's education, job training, family, really close to the people, establish personal relationships and really help them grow. And similarly, philanthropically, one can do it in the same way, addressing all of these items. So those are my comments.
Great. And, Mari doesn't just talk about this Catholic Community Foundation as well, that have a lot of donor-advised accounts that help in this area. And I think that's another important dimension, is to volunteer, get involved. Use your God-given gifts, as Mari has done very beautifully, to help build a more just society. And she mentions the looting and the anarchy, and the church decries that as well, the destruction of property and of course the taking of any life. And I think we have to be clear about that. I would say, though, that sometimes, and this isn't Mari's response, but sometimes people, as I don't know if it's Ryan or Sergio said, we respond by immediately saying it's either this or that. We get into one of the camps. I think we do have to acknowledge, and Dr. Martin Luther King talked about this, is that tumult that comes up and that expresses it sometimes in ways that people don't like, in ways that are destructive, are bubbling up from a kind of a milieu of injustice, and to try to understand where that reaction is coming from, I think, is attendant upon people of faith as well. So, Marshall, what can our
voice of the unheard?
Yeah,
That's, I think, how Martin Luther King said it.
And you were the one who told me that. I think I heard that from you.
Okay.
And it's very powerful. Thoughts on how we can respond from a place of faith?
Well, I think I go back to what I said before, is that we have to reach out and ask questions, and we need to find those who are willing to answer those questions and answer their questions, because hopelessness is the seed of all this destruction. So, Proverbs 14:31 says, "He who oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God." So there is a segment of our society that is in need. We have to reach out.
So to follow up, because we got a question in and on this very topic, because I think it's a really good question, and the Lourdes panel can answer, but I want to also stay on this question of the light of faith. How does one-on-one encounter and trying to encourage hope look like without it being perceived as patronizing or tokenizing? I think that's a good question. How do you enter into that experience with another who might be struggling with a lack of hope without it really kind of, seeming almost in a way that is like a put down, or I have something that you don't, or any thoughts either from Marshall or any of the panelists on that?
I heard something really good on Saturday. So I went to an archdiocese event about global partnerships, and it was pretty much just an event where we talked about our sister parishes. As most people probably know, our sister parish is in Tijuana, and I forgot the priest's name. I should have remembered it, but he gave this quote that I thought was really excellent in this regard. And he was talking about St. Teresa of Calcutta, and he said St. Teresa of Calcutta didn't go to serve the poor to be Christ for them. She went to go serve the poor to meet Christ in them. And I think that's kind of the way to go at it, is, recognizing that, that every person is the image of God, and they have that dignity and that respect and that sacredness to them. And it's not all about, you being the savior, more or less. So
that's very powerful. We have a number of questions coming in, so we'll take those up after you and Ryan respond to the third question. How do you see the light of our faith, helping really kind of inspire justice and to folks who might be struggling?
Well, I'll just give a shout out to what Ryan said in his interview with the Archdiocese on this topic. I remember that he said we have to be good Catholics, and I remember that struck me, and I was thinking about that, and I was like, well, what does that mean? Like, what do we have to do to be good Catholics? And the way that I've been kind of thinking about it recently is like, it's to follow Christ. And we do that in two ways, and that's by imitating him and by listening to him. And if we think about imitating Christ, well, what is the incarnation but God on high, God the highest thing we could ever conceive of, coming down into our broken world, and not just our broken world, but coming into the world of the poor, the downtrodden, and serving and living and eating and being with them. And all throughout the Gospels, we see him healing people, helping them with their real problems. And more often than not, he just does it. He doesn't judge them beforehand. More often than not, he's moved to pity, and he just goes and serves them. And I think that's an example that we have to follow. I mean, the other advice I'd say, listen to what he says about serving the poor. Listen to what he says when he references groups that were marginalized during the time, the Samaritans, the Gentiles, people that in Jesus' time, the Jewish people didn't associate with. And think about the attitude that Christ has with them. We have to have the same attitude with our brothers and sisters, no matter what they look like. So, that's what I would say.
And one thing, as you're passing on to Ryan, Marshall mentioned Proverbs, and you referenced the scriptural ethic. It's amazing how clear that ethic is in both testaments across various genres, whether it's the prophets or the law or Proverbs, the wisdom literature, and then in the New Testament, Jesus takes this up in various parables. It's extraordinary, and it's powerful, but it's also convicting in terms of how clear that biblical ethic is with regard to that God expects justice from us and us to reach out to those who are in need. So Ryan, take it away.
Yeah, so the scripture reading that we've all heard week after week is, Master, when did I clothe you? When did I educate you? When did I stand up for you in the public arena? It's my child, what you've done for the least of my people, you've done for me. And so, I mentioned I'm a homeowner, but my house is in North Minneapolis. So those who are familiar with the stigma that's around that part of town, I moved over there because it was I wasn't afraid to live around people of color, and it was a great deal on a house. But in living there 5 years, holy smokes, I've seen, I've been able to do well in Minnesota, but there's an entire zip code that's been left behind. And so see the least of my people, and I just feel as a man of faith who's been blessed, it's incumbent upon me to do whatever I can in some small way to share what I know with my neighbors around here. It's absolutely unacceptable. So that's my story. But I think this past summer with George Floyd and everything that's gone on, the world has seen and heard the cries of the least. So as Catholics, this is a great opportunity, folks, to minister to the least around you. There's no excuses about what's going on or what may not be going on. We're seeing suffering. We're taught how to deal with that. To answer that previous specific question, well, how do we do that, Ryan? Well, you got to pray first and be authentic and legitimately want to help, pray. And I can almost guarantee that the Lord will send you someone that you can be of service to. It's like the Good Samaritan story. He's just walking down the road and saw somebody on the side and decided to help. So just live your lives, folks, but pray and say, pray that, or just commit yourself to being engaged and doing for the least of. Pray and keep your eyes and ears and heart open. It's gonna all these things. You can't be Minnesota nice about it. You're gonna have to come out of your kind of comfort zone, but you'll be blessed. Trust me, because it's an opportunity in the moment that we can't miss as Catholics. Especially just our history as a church. And our stigma. What a great opportunity to rise above that and maybe right some of those wrongs. Because in 2020, it's our community of faith that stepped up and engaged and did the right thing.
That's great. I'm going to get to a couple of questions, they're good questions. One of the things I've said in preaching is, in this moment now in our country's history, Catholics are 1/4 of the population in the United States. There is so much extraordinary potential for good if Catholics live our faith and we get involved, we enter into relationships and friendships, we work for justice. We can have a really powerful effect on our society as a leaven, from within. So here's an interesting question, and I'll put it to any of you. You can just answer as you like. How has each of the panelists' faith personally helped them to navigate any injustice that you might have experienced or endured? How has your faith helped? Or I would broaden it, to any harm that you might have experienced as well. So anybody who has a thought, go for it, jump in.
Well, real quick, for me, it's a couple things. First, it's just the sacraments and knowing that I'm a part of a faith community that, Sergio and I were talking about this before, growing up as kids. So I'm a part of a bigger community than the socioeconomic, whatever country or economic demographic that united by this faith, the Catholic Church. So I've always clung to that there's something higher that I can always kind of appeal to. The other one was more practical, is serving as a Eucharistic minister. When there's 100 people, and I'm holding the host saying a body of Christ, and they're all of different races and size and shapes and backgrounds, that transformed me in terms of seeing Ryan, this is the body of Christ. All these.
I think for me, it's just really young, is that God is always there with you, even when you're going through a really hard time, even when you're suffering, even when it doesn't seem like it makes sense. To me, it's just, especially when I look at the cross and when I think about the life of Christ, God is there and He knows, and to me, that's really hopeful, and it really helps me get through difficult times, but it also helps me, grow in my relationship with Christ too. And yeah, I guess that's what I would say.
Of effect, we believe in a personal God. At the beginning of this extraordinary document, Spe Salvi, Pope Benedict talks about Saint Bakita, who experienced great torment and suffering. She was a slave, and she ends up encountering Christ in a profound way, and it literally transforms her life. And the injustices continued, sadly, but she was able to navigate it in a way because she had had this extraordinarily personal encounter, and you speak to that, I think, in a way that's really powerful and true. Other thoughts, Marshall or Mari, on this question of how your faith can help you endure challenging circumstances?
So I don't know about challenging circumstances per se, but I think our faith teaches us to, use the God-given talents that we have. And Deacon Wininger, who was here, always talked about finding your unique gift in faith, and gift is, and figuring out how we can use that to give back and to, even if we're not directly faced with adversity, through just sharing your talents.
Perfectly timed as we just mailed out our stewardship mailing yesterday. Right. She was not a plant, but I would say the Holy Spirit might have had something to do with that. But very true in terms of our gifts and putting them to good use. Marshall, any thoughts on this question?
I just keep thinking that God is in control. That's what I think about to get me through adversity that is bigger than me, and how to act, vessel to represent Him.
Thank you. There is no doubt that those who are watching from home and taking this in are really gaining a lot. I can tell you, I am personally. I've written down a lot. I mean, there's just a lot of agents, I think, in a powerful way. So thank you to our panelists for their thoughtfulness. Want to ask another question here. How do we expand beyond feeding the hungry, which is really caritas, it's charity, in the Catholic faith, which the church has done well over 2 millennia, to really helping people get on a path to good education, better paying jobs, opportunities to truly begin to break down barriers for communities of color. Now, this is a huge question. It's going to be some of what Sergio takes up when he presents on this topic in the coming months. How do we really get to that work of justice? And I would add another category, transforming unjust social structures, which is kind of implied in the question. How do we begin to do that? It's a huge question. We're not going to be able to answer it. If anybody has a perfect answer, well, we'll certainly want you to talk to the politicians and those who make law and policy. But any thoughts on that question, how we move from direct charity to really the work of justice?
Just answer since I was given a shout out. I would say, that's honestly the question I try to answer with my PhD studies, and I have no idea how to do that. But my intuition tells me, and figure out what the problems are instead of thinking that you know the answer, that you know what's right, what the policy answer is, what people should be doing or shouldn't be doing. Just listen to them, see what's really going on in their lives. I think that's probably how I would probably be a better
Bring somebody to the cabin with you, or coach a ball team, or teach some kids how to skate and play hockey, or if you're on a farm, bring some kids from the city out to your farm. So it's about encounter. So on the Catholic side, we need to encounter more from the communities. I'm seeing that they need exposure to those moments. That's like what you just said, Sergio. That's when you can ask questions and listen, and then it grows from there. Or I know how to skate and I played hockey. How can I teach some kids who've never been to a real rink before? Or I know how to skate and I played hockey. How can I teach some kids who've never been to a real rink before, those type things.
That Ryan just mentioned, you're rightly ordered to your fellow neighbor and to your God at the same time. I mean, that is justice.
And one more real quick. You know, I understand what I'm asking is, holy smoke, what is this man asking? I'm an introvert. Like, that'd be incredibly awkward for me to go out with someone. That'd be a cross that we're going to have to carry because, again, they're strangers at this point, but like you said, they're still our brothers and sisters in God. So there's not that much to be afraid of.
Other thoughts, Mari?
You know, my husband and I talk about this. He's a tutor at John Paul II. And it seems to me that a lot of the children there have jobs and so on, and managing education and their jobs and language issues, etc. I think taking that personal interest, if you could have a parish, let's say like Lady of Lourdes, if we decided to so-called adopt a family each and make it a point to interact with this family on some regular periodicity, say once a month or something like that. This is a way I think we could establish really strong relationships. We could help them with learning English or getting better at it, provide guidance from a job or improving their skills, computer skills, etc. I just feel effective if we take this really strong person-to-person interest in people rather than, just donating money or saying that, this is a policy reaction that needs to happen at the government level, which generally is, very macro level. I don't know about handouts, but it's big programs and you lose the individual in that. So I think if we can marry up the macro programs with this micro involvement, which I think as a Catholic parish we are well suited to do. If we can do it, I feel like that would be pretty powerful.
And to that point, I mean, again, there's a convergence, and I see it as a movement of the Spirit. This is something, it's the exact same idea that Ryan brought, I think 6 weeks to 2 months ago, and then Marshall and Michael connected at Catholic Ascension School on this very same idea, and I think there's just a lot of merit in terms of that, and I smart and prudent. And by the way, Michael is here and Raj is here, all socially distant, and so we thank them for their support as well. I did say that we would end promptly at 8:15. There were a couple of other questions, and one question was, how. That was one question. Then the other is, how do we increase the opportunities for this type of opportunities? Before I thank the panelists, I wrote down a couple of things that we can do. A number of these have already been mentioned, so I'll just amplify. Mari said this, be informed. And so I wrote these down prior to coming here, and then the folks on our panel mentioned these as well, to be informed as to reality, to data, to people's experience, and the kind of fever pitch, but be informed as to the issues, including the disparities that exist in Minnesota. Listen, accompany those who have experienced harm and injustice, and then really enter into a relationship. Know what the church teaches on lectures on Catholic social teaching. We have this great richness. A lot of our panelists mention the Scripture. We always start with Scripture. As Catholics, we have both a right and a duty to vote, and according to our well-formed conscience. Advocate, get involved for a more just and inclusive society, state, community. The use of restorative justice practices is near and dear to my heart. And then Sergio will talk to us about what does an economy of inclusion look like. Oppose radical voices that either foster hate or ideology, or in our own Minneapolis, voices, I would say, on our city council that are completely naive and presenting not consistent with reason. That's my own opinion, but I would oppose that because I think it's untrue. And then finally, I just would point to pray that hearts would be transformed, that unjust structures would be transformed, that we would enter into try to foster hope together, So I would say this, just as we conclude, I had high hopes for this panel because I know all of these folks here, and I respect them, and they're people of goodwill and intelligence and compassion. I can tell you that my hope for this panel was even far surpassed. The Spirit was present here. I could feel it. It was present for sharing their wisdom and their faith and their compassion and their love for justice. So thank you. It is 8:17. Yep, please do.
To Pope Francis for naming the first U.S. Cardinal. So he will be installed in exactly a month's time. Wilton Gregory of Washington, D.C.
Yes.
is the first.
African American. And by the way, Wilton Gregory was, as a young bishop in Illinois in 2002, when a lot of the bishops were not exactly on terra firma, firm ground with regard to clergy abuse. He said something that has always stuck with me. We need bishops to respond with the hearts of a pastor rather than the heads of a lawyer, right? So we always go first to trying to do that rather than respond to those with compassion and also with justice. So congratulations to Cardinal-elect Archbishop Wilton Gregory of Washington, D.C. Thank you for that, Mari. And God bless you. Join us on the 11th of November for Dr. Yohuru Williams. We'll continue the theme of racial justice, not to be missed. He's a man of wisdom and a really powerful speaker. I want to thank Josh and Ben Zenner for bringing us fantastic live stream, and I thank Raj and Michael for their support and their presence. But great work for the Zenner boys for providing this great live stream. And thanks again to our panel. We'll see you on the 11th. Let's build a more just and charitable world, and get out and vote. Amen.